Up next, Gordon and I review the Sony Alpha 6500 on the Camera Labs Photography Podcast. Hello, this is Doug Kay. I'm here with Mr. Camera Labs himself, Gordon Laing. How are you, Gordon?
I'm very good, Doug. How are you? Nice to see you.
I'm doing very well. Thank you very much. And let's not waste any time. Let's get right into the Sony 6500. So often on these shows, I say the long-awaited such and such camera. This was not a long-awaited camera.
This was not. Only 8 months ago, Sony released the Alpha A6300 and raised the bar for its APS-C mirrorless line. They equipped it, they upgraded the A6000 with an even better autofocus system, high-resolution viewfinder, weather sealing, lots of cool things. A slower burst shooting mode that made it easier to follow action. People were pretty happy with this. 4K video, uncropped in most modes. It worked really, really well. So imagine everyone's surprise when 8 months after the A6300 was announced, Sony goes and announces the A6500, and that's what we're going to be talking about in this video.
And I'm one of those people because I had the original A6000, which I thought was quite a good camera. I was very excited to purchase, there's the A6000 right there. I was then very happy to purchase the A6300, which you can see right there, and then rather disappointed when so quickly Sony decided, no, that's really not good enough. We have something better that you should have bought in the first place.
Well, I think we're not going to dodge this issue. We are going to talk about it. I think we should talk about it towards the end of the video, but it's a tricky position when you're a company like Sony that is developing so quickly. Basically, do you sit on new technology until a reasonable period has passed? Or do you go, hey, we've got this hot new technology and we're already working on the thing after that, so let's just get it out. Let's just get the stuff out as and when we have it. So mull on those. and you at home as well, or wherever you're listening or watching, have a think about that. And as we go through the video and then we talk about the new features, we're going to discuss it towards the end. And we'd love to hear what you think in the comments as well, as to whether Sony is doing this too fast or whether it's perfectly reasonable.
Right. So let's assume no one has ever heard of any of these cameras. Give us the rundown. What are the basics of what this camera is all about?
Okay, so I've got the A6000 here. This is a mid-range mirrorless camera. It uses an APS-C size sensor that is 24 megapixels in resolution. It is a flat top style body, which means the viewfinder is not in a hump in the middle. Remember, these are not digital SLRs. They do not need to have a viewfinder in a specific position in order to work with an optical path and mirrors and prisms. It's an electronic viewfinder. They can put it wherever they want. So there are kind of two main styles of mirrorless cameras with viewfinders. Some of them put them in the middle for pure nostalgia, although, it does turn me on a bit. I do like a central viewfinder hump, as we like to call them. But other ones, it's never too late or early for a central viewfinder hump. Others prefer a flat top body, which is what Sony did for the A6000 and the NEX models before that. So the viewfinder is perched in the top left corner with a tilting screen below it. And pretty much this style has stayed consistent within the A6000 series. The original A6000 came out a while ago. Now, as we said at the beginning of the show, Sony updated it in 2016, early 2016, with the A6300, which looks essentially the same from the outside and shares the same resolution and same size sensor. And then the A6500 also shares that same flat top design. I mean, they have tweaked it as they've gone along, and I'll tell you exactly what those differences are. Physically, I may need to tell you what they are because they are quite subtle, the differences. But they kind of have the same core about them. They are flat top bodies with built-in electronic viewfinders, tilting screens, 24 megapixel APS-C sensors. What Sony has, however, done is, as it's added more features, in the same way as it has to its RX100 series, it has gradually edged the price up. So when the A6000 first came out, it was firmly a mid-range mirrorless camera. The A6300 pushed that up, and now the A6500 pushes that up even further. So really, in APS-C terms, it is a high-end model now. If you're including full-frame bodies, then you would describe this as an upper mid-range body, but it's definitely up there, competing in price against, models like Fujifilm's X-T2, the Olympus OMD M1 Mark II is more expensive, but that sort of class of cameras. So this seems as good a time as any, Doug, to talk about prices. How much is an A6500 body?
This camera in the US is roughly $1,400, $1,398 to be precise as of this moment. As you say, it's getting up there. These used to be sub $1,000 cameras.
So what's the premium over the 6300?
The difference is $400. So pretty much exactly. The 6300 new today is just under $1,000 US.
And do you have, just for us to think about this for a minute, do you have a price for the Fujifilm X-T2?
Yeah, the X-T2 actually costs $200 more here in the US. So that's roughly $1,600.
Okay, now all of those models that we've mentioned are APS-C sensors. They're 24 megapixels. They do 4K video, so they have that in common. And they're aimed at a higher-end market, so they've got lots of, high-end control. So that just gives you a kind of idea of where they all fit in. Let's talk, I think, about the main differences between the A6500 and the 6300. I mean, the 6300, so we know it's a flat-top body. We know it's got built-in electronic viewfinder, XGA resolution. The features I'm going to talk about now are shared with the A6500. They both have these in common. 24 megapixel APS-C sensor. They both have this incredible embedded phase detect autofocus system, which has 425 points spread across almost the entire sensor. Now, both cameras can shoot at a top speed of 11 frames per second, or if you slow them down to 8 frames per second, you get a kind of live feedback between frames. So when you're panning to follow the action, you actually get, if it changes direction or speeds up or slows down, you can actually compensate for that. So that does give you a kind of DSLR-like experience through the viewfinder. So none of those things have changed. They both also film 4K video at 24 to 30p. At 24 and 25p, that 4K video is uncropped. It uses the full frame width, which is actually quite unusual. Most cameras, including the X-T2, do crop, even just a little bit. They still crop. Now, the interesting gotcha about the A63 and 6500 is that when you're filming 4K at 30p, the data rate is just a bit too high for it to be able to scale down that full sensor width. So it actually takes a mild crop first to make that easier. They both also film 1080 at 24 to 60p without a crop, or at 100 or 120p, again with a minor crop. So if you're filming at 120p and you put that in a 24p timeline, you're getting a 5 times slowdown. So that's pretty good. So all of those things are identical. Weatherproof body, that aspect, same battery, you can charge them or power them over USB. All of those are identical. So if you think, yeah, that's the camera I want, that's the camera for me, then go out and buy the A6300 because it has all of that.
I just wanted to mention two things you touched on rather than just come back to them. Let's hit them right now. The first is something that I read in your extensive review on CameraLabs.com of this marvelous camera. Something I hadn't thought about before. You mentioned we're sort of pushing the limits of processing speed and power. And one of the subtleties here was that when shooting 4K video, you can't use the brightest LCD setting. Now I know that's getting us off in the weeds a little bit, but I just didn't want to lose that because that's a fascinating point. And apparently, I don't know if it's fact or conjecture that has to do with a heat, perhaps.
Yeah. Now, this is something which some reviewers may not notice or point out. Anyone who shoots video, though, will notice it straight away. This was a problem which faced the A6300 as well. Now, unfortunately, the A6500 inherits a lot of the things that annoyed me screen-wise about the A6300. And in fact, some of them are on the A6000 as well. So I'm going to go over them one by one, and I am going to get to screen brightness. The first, and I'm going to show you on the A6000 here, is the screen shape. It is a 16 by 9 shaped screen, 3-inch screen, 16 by 9. That's great if you're filming video, 16 by 9 video. It fills the screen, looks lovely. If you're shooting stills in the native 3 by 2 aspect ratio, though, they're displayed with black bars down the left and right side. So the actual viewable image, whether you're composing or reviewing it, is smaller. Now, if you were to compare this side by side against a lot of its rivals, they all say they have 3-inch screens, although some of the DSLRs have 3.2. The bottom line is that the still photos look bigger on them, and bigger is always better on the screen. You get more detail, it looks nicer. So I don't like the shape of the Sony screen. One of the reasons it is this shape is because the flat top body, because it has to fit the viewfinder above the screen. So the screen is squashed down. If they put in a taller screen, then the viewfinder would have to be on top of the body, or the body would have to be taller. It would need a centrally located viewfinder hump, which I am cool with. I love that style. I wish Sony would make an APS-C mirrorless camera that was styled like the A7 series, with the viewfinder perched on top. Then they could implement a taller screen with a more stills-friendly aspect ratio. Okay, that's the first complaint I've got with it. The second, inherited on all three of these bodies, is the articulation. And I'll show you on the A6000 for anyone who's watching the video. On YouTube, hello, nice to see you. It can angle up by 90 degrees, which is great when you're shooting at waist level. And it will angle down by about 45 degrees, which is great if you're shooting over the heads of crowds. However, as we've discussed many times on our videos before, Doug, that does not help you if you are shooting in the portrait orientation with the camera held vertically, which I do all the time. Unless, of course, you're shooting around the corner, that does not help you compose more comfortably at high or low angles. That is the first problem with this articulation. The second problem is that this screen will not flip forward either at the top, at the bottom, or at the side. It will not face forward to face the subject. Now, you might think, oh, that's just for selfies. That's just for people who, do that. Although, plenty of people do that. But for me, it's an issue because I do some video logging, some vlogging, and you need to see yourself in the screen. And the fact is that you cannot see yourself in the screen of any of these A6000 bodies because the screen does not face forward. And that to me is a terrible shame because the autofocus system on it is brilliant. The video quality is brilliant. And, otherwise they would be the perfect vlogging cameras. Okay, so that's two complaints I've got, the screen shape and the articulation. Now let's get on to the brightness, which is what you asked me about 3 days ago. The screen brightness on all these Sony cameras is very dim by default. It's very hard to see in bright conditions. Now, I think they have it turned down because it saves power. But the fact is it becomes very, very hard to see in bright conditions outdoors. So you go into the menus and you choose the sunny weather option, and that boosts the screen brightness and suddenly it becomes perfectly visible. Everything is happy. Maybe your battery will run down a bit faster, but at least you can see what's going on. Until that is, you start trying to film 4K video. Because when you do set the camera to 4K video, that sunny weather option for the screen brightness disappears, and you are returned to the default brightness. Now, this also happens when you're filming 1080 at 100 or 120p. It doesn't happen if you're filming 1080 at 24 to 60p, but it does happen at 1080, 100 and 120p, and it happens in all the 4K frame rates. That sunny weather option disappears, and you are left with a dim screen, a screen that is so dim you basically cannot see it if the sun is out and you're outside, which is very frustrating. It means that if you are filming 4K or the high frame rate 1080 with this camera, or indeed the A6300, you need to be using the viewfinder outside, or of course take an HDMI feed to an external monitor. But it is frustrating, and that's something that they haven't fixed. I did complain about it. Everyone complained about it who noticed it on the 6300, but they've not changed that on the 6500. And I guess it is either a battery thing or an overheating thing. But it's frustrating nonetheless.
So while we're mentioning video, did they finally add a headphone jack to this camera?
They haven't. That's one of the other complaints that I have about it. I was going to save that towards the end. There are a number of things, a number of features that are forgivable on a camera that costs less than $1,000. And you go, it'd be nice if it had that, but, I get it. But once you start edging the price up, and this is now a $1,400 camera, you begin to notice these things. They are notable by their absence. One of them is a headphone jack. To be fair, not many of its competitors have a headphone jack either. But this is something that they could have done or added with an accessory. Fujifilm on the X-T2, for example, adds it with that battery grip. Now, one thing, they have improved one thing on the screen, and this brings us to our first big new feature on the A6500, and it is a touchscreen! Yay!
But
yes, but it hardly does anything. Boo! So they put a touchscreen on it, which is great. You know, I've been banging on them for ages. People who like touchscreens have been banging on it for ages. So well done, Sony. Thank you very much. Don't get us wrong. We love having a touchscreen. And to be fair, you can do the most important thing you use a touchscreen for, which is tap to reposition that AF area, whether it's a zoned area or a single AF area. You can move it around by touch. They've also implemented a touchpad AF option where you can adjust it using the screen while you're composing through the viewfinder. The idea is that you drag it around with your finger or your thumb while you're looking through the viewfinder. You may well think, oh, well, if you are a left-eyed viewfinder user, like I am, then you will be moving that AF area with your nose. And indeed you can, if you like. But Sony's rather cleverly allows you to configure that touchpad AF. You can switch it off altogether if you don't want it. But you can configure it to use either the whole screen area, the right half, which misses your nose, or even the right quarter, which definitely misses your nose, unless you've got an enormous nose. So I found that the default is the right half, and that's what I did. And even though I'm a left eye viewfinder user, I could push it around with my thumb very successfully. The only downside, though, was that it felt fairly sluggish. It wasn't very responsive. When you moved it with your finger or thumb while you were composing through the viewfinder, it kind of lagged a bit. Maybe it's because my thumb was also touching my nose was touching another part of the screen. I don't know. The bottom line is that when I did it, my experience of it was that it was not that responsive. Your mileage may vary. Great news that they've got the touchscreen on there, though, and you can touch to pull focus while you're filming. This is a video I filmed with I thought, let's make it really hard for it here. So I fitted the FE85mm f1.4 G Master lens, which is a fantastic prime lens. Remember, on an APS-C body, that's equivalent to more like, getting on for 130mm. So it's a long focal length. I've opened it wide to f1.4 and I positioned it very close to these containers that you can see in the video. And I used the touch screen to tap each one. And it just demonstrates how good the AF system is, but especially now coupled with a touch screen, because previously on the A6300, there was no way of telling the camera where you wanted it to focus and when you wanted it to focus. It could focus very well in movies, but you couldn't instruct it the where and when. Now you can, at least with this, by tapping on the screen. So that works really well. But then you begin to think, well, how else have they implemented this touch screen? So the first thing you do is you go into playback and you try and swipe across the screen and then find that it doesn't work. You cannot swipe between images in playback. You cannot pinch to zoom in playback. You can double tap in playback to go to a kind of maximum view and then push it around and double tap to take it back, but you cannot swipe through images or choose your own magnification level with a pinch. The other thing you can't do is tap your way through the menus. Now, to be fair, the 16:9 shaped screen does mean it's quite short vertically, but you've only got to use a Canon camera with a touch screen or a Panasonic to see how easily it is to tap your way through the entire menu system. Even though they look like they're little options on the screen, you can tap your way through and scroll through them, swipe through them. And when you look at the Sony user interface, it has, like most cameras, a superimposed kind of function menu that displays, fat icons over the screen to change popular features. This sort of thing is crying out for touch control. You should be able to tap those nice fat icons to say, yeah, I want to change the ISO, I want to change the metering, I want to change, the focusing mode. So it's frustrating that it's not got those. Where it gets even more frustrating is when you need to type in some information. Now, if you're connecting the camera to the Wi-Fi, it shows a QWERTY keyboard, and that, thank heavens, is touch sensitive. But if you're entering other text details, it uses more of a kind of mobile phone, old style text keyboard, where you would tap ABCs on one keyboard and you would tap it once for A, twice for B, and 3 times for C. You remember those keypads?
Yeah.
Well, the user interface, the operating system on the Sony has that keyboard option. It uses it in the Bluetooth menu, which we'll talk about in a minute, uses it in the copyright menu, I think. But even though it's got these nice big icons, it's not touch sensitive either. And you're like, oh my God, it's got a keyboard with fat icons and it's not touch sensitive, but the other one is. But then why use 2 different keyboards and why make one of them touch sensitive and the other one not? And this makes you kind of look more closely at the user interface and make you think, this is inconsistent. Not only is it frustrating, but it's inconsistent and it's confusing and it's not intuitive. And I think Sony are really running away with themselves technologically, and they've got some amazing technology. I mean, the AF system and the burst shooting, and I'll talk about the buffer depth as well. The processing of the data is way ahead of what its rivals are doing, but it needs to just go, whoa, there a minute, and have a good look at that user interface, the operating system as well, and say, look, let's just, instead of just bolting things on it, let's add that, let's add that, let's add that, and then realize that they don't quite integrate properly. Let's just redesign it from scratch and put on a really good user interface, because that would make so much difference, because things like that are inconsistent and frustrating.
Yeah, it's the weirdest thing. This line of cameras now, the Alpha mirrorless line, is more than 3 years old. I think the NEX, what was the first one? The NEX.
Yeah, 3 and 5 it launched with, yeah.
And so that's coming up 4 years, I think, now. They've had plenty of time to get it right. They've had plenty of complaints. And your point about having two different styles of keyboard on the same machine, it's, how do these things get out the door without somebody? I mean, especially since the image quality of these cameras is so phenomenal. It's fascinating to me that they could, in a world where their competitors are doing such a better job, that they can continue to get this wrong.
I mean, I'll talk about it now, because you and I talk about it all the time. One of the benefits, and I'm going to do inverted commas in the air, one of the benefits of the Sony system is having these downloadable apps, right? But as time goes on, I see it less and less of an advantage for two reasons. First of all, these downloadable apps, which say equip them with better bracketing or intervalometer features, generally, most of these types of features are already included as standard on competitors' cameras. You don't need to download them, right? Mm-hmm. The other problem with the way the app system works, though, is that each app has its own menu and has its own settings that work independently of the main settings. So believe it or not, you could find yourself in an app, say an intervalometer app, with a different photo quality setting on it. So you may think that you've already got it set to, say, RAW plus JPEG and the maximum resolution. But then when you're in the app, it will ignore that and a load of other settings, and it will say, no, you need to set them all again. So and once you get your head around that, you think, right, now I can handle that. Then you think, oh, yeah, right, I must make sure that I also reset that menu to my preferred thing. And then you find that for some reason that option isn't there. Mm-hmm. And you think, why doesn't it just use the main menu system? And in fact, if it's a limitation of the app system, why have the app system at all? Why not just have it built in as standard? And the one that frustrates me most of all is the smart remote. Now, the Sony they've got a very, very good Wi-Fi implementation, especially if you have a camera with NFC, proper NFC, not Apple NFC. I mean, like a Samsung NFC that actually works for more than just Apple's world. Because if you have a picture playing on the screen, it's brilliant. You have a picture playing on the screen and you hold your phone to the side of the body, it is intelligent enough to work out that you want to get that picture onto your phone. So it will automatically launch the app, set up networks, connect the networks, transfer the picture, disconnect everything gracefully, and then reconnect your phone back to whatever network it was on, even if it was on someone else's Wi-Fi network. The whole thing takes about half a minute, and you do not need to touch a single button. No one else does that. Everyone else says at some point, you want, is this what you want to do? The picture you got on the screen that you were looking at, is that what you want? Are you sure? You want that on the phone you're holding next to it? Because I'm not sure that's what you want. It's like, yeah, of course that's what I want. Just do it. And then the Sony does it even better, because if you have it in record mode, so you are taking a picture, you have a live view on the screen and you hold your phone against it, then of course what you're trying to do is get the phone to remote control it. So it fires up the remote control app. Even better. But here's the gotcha. If you get any of these cameras, this applies to any of Sony's cameras to date. We're recording this towards the end of 2016. To date, what happens is you get the app on your phone, even if you're running the latest app on your phone. Do you like my phone? It looks just on my hand, doesn't it? And what happens, I'm actually treating this. This is my Samsung phone. It's the new Galaxy S. It's rather warm at the moment. What happens is you'd be like, wait a minute. Where are all the manual exposure controls? Surely a camera of this class should have manual exposure controls. That's okay. I can live with automatic exposure, but I am going to tap to... Wait a minute. I can't even tap to refocus on the screen. What's going on? This is because, by default, Sony ships all of these cameras to date with a really super basic version of the remote control. And it is, of course, an app. It's the Smart Remote app. So the first thing you need to do when you buy any of these cameras is update that app. Now, it's not just as simple as connecting the camera to the internet, and that's not that simple. You have to connect it to the internet and then log in, lest we forget, with the tiny little user interface, you have to then log into the Sony Play Memories system. Oh, you don't have a Play Memories account. You need to set one of those up. You can't do that on the camera. You've got to do that on another device. So you set that up, you get your login credentials, you log back in again, you finally get to update that app, and then and only then do you unlock the full manual control. The full manual control, which lest we forget, is already available on Panasonic, Olympus, Fujifilm, and Canon on all of their remote control software. It's all there. Why is Sony making us jump through these hoops? They're doing it because they want to sign up people to Play Memories, but I kid you not, I bet most people get about halfway through that process and go, like that. And I know I have several times.
You know, I have my 6300. I have not installed a single app because I used to do that on the 6000 and it was just such a pain in the ass. It just wasn't, it's not worth it. And like you say, why can't those things be built in? Obviously, there's enough memory because you can load up a number of apps. There's still room to put them into the camera. And yet you go through this inane process. They charge you a few dollars, which obviously is not a major profit center for Sony. I don't know, frustrating. Okay.
Hey, while we're talking about wireless, let's talk about one of the other new features the A6500 has over its predecessor. In fact, it has over any Sony camera, as far as I know. This is the first time Sony's done this. Now, when you're testing the Wi-Fi on these cameras, one of the things you'll notice on the Sony cameras compared to the competition is that there's no location logging. There's no easy way to embed the coordinates of where you are on your pictures. There is a kind of half-hearted way which can do it when you actually copy a picture from the camera to the phone. It can tag it during that process. But then you have to remember to choose the original resolution if you're going to then archive that. It's a bit of a mess. So that was always a bit of a complaint. But now what Sony have done is they've gone along the same route that Nikon has with SnapBridge, and they have now equipped the A6500 with Bluetooth. This is in addition to Wi-Fi and NFC. So it uses Bluetooth to actually maintain a low power link with your smartphone and request a position from your phone when it takes a picture. And this runs all the time. Now, the great thing about Bluetooth is that it's low power, so it doesn't consume much of your battery. And the other great thing is that you don't have to kind of initiate the process every time. It just sort of, it can do it all by itself, which is really neat, which is what you want. And it works really well. What you have to do, you do have to get it right the first time. It did get me thinking at first. What you do is you first of all have to pair the camera with your phone. That's the same as any Bluetooth system. So they're paired. And you'll notice a little icon on the back of the screen, like a kind of world map icon, but it'll have a line through it. You'll be like, why? My phone's on. I'm outside. Why isn't it transferring this information? I don't get it. Well, that's because you have to start the process from the Play Memories app on your phone. So tap them together or connect them by whatever means you want. And then the app on your phone will say, hey, do you want to connect these devices for the Bluetooth location login? It's like, yeah, I was rather hoping that would have happened already. So then it goes through a menu and it says, I see you've already paired with the A6500. Is that the camera you want? Say yes. From that point on, the little icon will change to a proper world map and you're good to go. And it's brilliant because you never have to do that again. You can switch the camera off, you can switch the phone off, you can switch them back on again. When they're both on, they would just talk to each other. And I have not noticed any hit on battery life, anything noticeable. It just works. I mean, like all smartphone GPS solutions, it's at the mercy of your phone. And with my Galaxy S7, if it's in my pocket, I find that sometimes it can be about 10 or 20 meters out. So if I want to be critical about a picture, say if I'm doing a landscape shot, sometimes what I'll do is I'll take the phone out, wait a few seconds for it to really know where it is, and then take the picture. But that's no fault of Sony. That's just, the way that the phones work. So I think that's a great feature. And I think hopefully we should see it on most new Sony cameras, certainly the higher end ones going forward. So that's Bluetooth. So that works really well. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's terrific because it obviously also a lot of the solutions that you otherwise use require that your phone and your camera be in sync in terms of time, because it's something you're going to do in post where you're going to extract the data from the phone and use it to tag the images. Here, you're doing it in real time. So you have the chance, as you say, of very high accuracy. Did you try it just with so one thing to clarify, you did have to install the app on your phone as well. It's not using something native on the phone. You're communicating with an app that's location aware on the phone as well as on the camera.
That's a good question. Now, the Bluetooth pairing takes place at an operating system level. In order to instruct the phone to send the required information to the camera, you need to initiate that process from the Sony Play Memories app. So you do need to download that for your phone. Whether it needs that going forward from that point on, I don't know. Obviously, you need it if you want to transfer photos or remote control it. So you're going to have it on your phone anyway. But I don't know if it uses it. Certainly, I can turn my phone off and, I've not launched the app. There may be some service running in the background. I think that's probably what it's doing, is running a little service in the background. But there's been no impact in terms of performance or battery on my phone. So I think it's a good feature.
No, I think it's great. It's something that I use. I use GPS logging all the time, and I think it's excellent. If it works, particularly if you don't have to start the Play Memories app subsequently, and I guess we can track that down and figure it out. The biggest problem for me when I do GPS logging is I walk out the door in the morning and I'm barely awake because I haven't had enough of Gordon's coffee. And I will forget to turn on my GPS logging until halfway through the day. And so the morning shots have no latitude, longitude information. So if it automates it a bit more, that would be a step forward.
No, it does. It does. I can absolutely confirm you do not need to launch anything on your phone for this to work. Once you have initiated the process, it runs some sort of service in the background that will do the connecting for you. So the moment you do wake up in the morning and you start taking photos, so long as your phone is on and it's the one that's paired with your camera, it will be embedding those coordinates. You can, of course, turn that off and disable it if you want. But yeah, you don't need that's the thing I like about it. All the other solutions require you to initiate it in some way. And then in the case of the ones that need to do a log, you then need to synchronize that log later. So there's no need. But these are just the Bluetooth and the touch screen are just they're the gravy. They're on the new features. The big feature on the A6500 is that it has built-in image stabilization, sensor shift stabilization, which of course is on the full frame Alphas and the SLTs. But it's not. This is the first time they've put it in an APS-C mirrorless body. And impressively, the body is barely bigger or heavier than it was before. So Sony are good at this, aren't they? They're very good at miniaturization. I don't know how they fitted it in. Maybe it was always there, or maybe they left space for it, or who knows. Anyway, basically, it has no impact on the size, and very little impact on the weight. Not that you'd notice, but it now has sensor shift stabilization. It's 5-axis, obviously, because they all are. So you have up and down and left and right, but you also have rotating, and you have the pitch and the yaw as well. Sony reckons it's good for 5 stops. I tested it thoroughly for stills and video. You were about to ask me a question.
No, keep going. You're going in the right direction.
Okay, so the first thing I did was, again, put on that. I do like that FE85mm 1.4 G Master lens. It is a very, very nice lens, but it's also a big lens and a long lens, and it is not an optically stabilized lens. So the first thing you notice normally when you put it on a unstabilized body is the view is wobbling. Now, I shake quite a lot. I keep asking you all to buy me a coffee, and you might think, I'm not going to buy Gordon a coffee because it makes him shake, but please do get me a coffee because it keeps me going. But the bottom line is that I do shake quite a lot. And when I'm composing with an unstabilized system with a bit longer focal lengths, that view is wobbling. Of course, we all had to live with that in the old days before stabilized systems came along. But as soon as kind of companies like Olympus came along and started doing built-in stabilization that works with any lens you attach, you'd be attaching these longer telephotos and going, wow, the view is just eerily steady in the viewfinder. It makes it so much easier to compose. So the first thing I noticed when I mounted this lens on the A6500 is, again, the floating view in the viewfinder. It just becomes very, very steady, and it is very easy to compose that shot, especially if you're being very precise, trying to line stuff up, have something directly in the middle or directly on, some of your alignment grids, which I do all the time because I shoot a lot of architecture, so I want it to be absolutely square and straight. So before you've even taken the photo or filmed video, I want it. It's a great feature because it makes it so much nicer to compose. In terms of taking still photos, I found I didn't get 5 stops personally of compensation. I did get 4 stops though, typically. I also shot with the Zeiss 24mm f1.8, and I got about 4 stops out of that. So it's a highly valuable capability to have, and it really enhances this body. It's really interesting for video, though, because, again, it just makes filming with unstabilized lenses, like the two I've mentioned. Previously, I couldn't film with them handheld. I'd be wobbling too much. It's not like with stills where you say, well, you might be wobbling through the viewfinder, but as soon as you choose that fast shutter speed, you won't have camera shake. You can't do that with video. The body needs to be stable. Either it has to be on a tripod or some sort of gimbal. But now with this built-in stabilization, you get very smooth output. And in this video that you can hopefully see if you're watching us on YouTube, you can see this is filmed with the 85mm 1.4, and I'm filming this deliberately in a very uncomfortable way. I'm holding I was on the top of a building which had a big glass balcony that was taller than my head. So I'm holding the camera at arm's length above my head with the screen tilted down. Remember, there's this big heavy lens hanging off the front of it. So this is not an ideal, stable hand-holding situation. And you can see it's not perfect, but it's certainly very good. The next question is, how does it compare, say, to the Olympus, especially the most recent EM5 Mark II and EM1 Mark II? They're both unbelievable. Olympus has been doing this for a long time, and their stabilization, I'd say, is still a step ahead of what Sony and Panasonic and the others are doing. Particularly, you notice that kind of eerie floating effect. On the Sony, I was doing that with a lens that was equivalent to maybe about 100, 150 mil. Well, I can do that on the Olympus with a lens that's equivalent to 600 mil, which is ridiculous, and it still looks incredibly steady. You can also, if you're shooting with a wider lens on the Olympus, you can walk with it, and you get that kind of Steadicam, kind of floating, bouncing person walking along with it. With the Sony and the Panasonic, it's not quite. If you're very careful and very aware of how you're filming, you can get a good result when you're walking, but it's not quite as good as the Olympus. But the fact that we're even saying it's not quite as good as the thing that's better than anyone, and lest we forget also has a smaller sensor, Sony's done an amazing job here, and this alone makes this camera so much more usable for both stills and video, even when you're composing, than its predecessors. And that, for me, makes it so much more of an all-round, more desirable camera. It's a great feature. And the interesting thing about it now, let's have a look. Sony has built-in stabilization. Panasonic now has it and is getting better with every generation. Olympus has had it for ages. This now leaves Fujifilm looking a little bit out in the cold. And unfortunately, as I understand it, because of the way they designed the X mount, they can't implement sensor shift stabilization in there without intruding on the area outside the imaging circle and potentially losing quality in the corner. So they've got a bit of a dilemma. They could implement it digitally, but then you impose a crop and a lot of pixel wrangling, which has a great reduction in quality. So this is now becoming not so much an advantage for Sony, but a disadvantage for Fuji, because it's suddenly becoming one of the only ones that doesn't have it. So well done, Sony. This is a fantastic new feature. And for me, that with the Bluetooth and the touchscreen, there's a few other extras as well, but those three are worth the $400 difference for me between this model and the A6300.
Yeah, it's and it's only been 1 year since Sony introduced image stabilization on the full frame cameras.
Yeah, it's not that long ago, is it? And that made such a difference on those. Yeah.
That's very impressive.
There's a few other things to kind of like hoover up, a few other benefits. One feature that kind of will go under the radar for a lot of people, but is really important to a very small number of people, is every time I review a kind of sports type camera, all of the bird and wildlife photographers say, can you link the spot metering to the active AF area? And if you've never heard this before, you go, what? What do you mean? Spot metering is in the middle, right? It's a little spot in the middle, and you point it at the thing you want to meter for, and then you recompose, and that's what spot metering does, right? Great. But imagine this scenario. Imagine you have got a bird flying, so it's like a dark coloured bird, flying in front of an overcast white sky, right? Or a really dark background. Spot metering is really useful for getting the metering just right on this creature. But this creature is not sat in the middle of the frame. This creature is flying all over the place. Now, wouldn't it be nice if your spot metering followed that AF area as it tracked it around the screen? That is called linking spot metering to the active AF point. And previously, it's something that you had to basically buy a Canon 1DX or a Nikon D4 to get. It is not on the lower class of DSLRs. It's not on a D500. It's not on a 7D Mark II. It's not on a 5D Mark IV. Those guys force you to go way up, which is one of the reasons why when you see birders, they have those massive DSLRs, because it's got this feature. Well, you can now get it on the A6500. It's buried away, of course. It's hard to find, but it is there. You can link spot metering to the active AF area. Now, this is also available on a couple of other mirrorless cameras. Olympus has it on the OMD EM1 Mark II, and I think maybe even on the Pen F. And I was speaking to Panasonic, and I'm not 100%, but I think they might have it on some of them, but I'm confirming. But I can tell you for sure that the A6500 does have it, and that coupled with its amazing autofocus system, fantastic burst shooting, remind me about buffer depth in a minute. Coupled with all those things, this is a serious wildlife camera. Now, this is a pretty serious piece of kit. So that's a new feature.
Yeah, and I want to go, I love that. I think it's great. I want to go back to something that you mentioned earlier. We've talked about this also previously when we reviewed the 6300. And this is the thing, the live feedback issue. This is so important for a camera designed for action. So I want to say this again. If you're using this camera at its maximum frame rate, 11 frames a second, or if you're using most mirrorless cameras without an optical viewfinder, there's a lag. The image that you're seeing in the viewfinder is not real time. And if you try and follow a bird or something, or fast-moving object, you'll be unsuccessful. And the reason is that you're not pointing the camera at where the bird is, you're pointing the camera at where the bird was, or something like that. The time is off. But Sony, at 8 frames a second on this camera, makes the feedback almost real time, making it much, much easier to track a moving object that's moving very quickly. Now, do other mirrorless cameras have this, do you know? Or is this unique to the Sonys?
No, what's unique to the Sony is that it does it very quickly. Fujifilm has it on the X-T2, but you need to slow it from 8 to 5 frames per second. Okay. It's also worth noting that Sony's A6500 does a lot of things with the body alone that, say, the X-T2 requires you to get the grip for. Mm-hmm. You know, the X-T2 will only film 10-minute 4K clips without the grip. The Sony would do half-hour 4K clips. The Fujifilm will shoot at 11 frames per second with a mechanical shutter, but only with the grip. The Sony will do it in the body just by itself. Both of them slow down if you want the live feedback, but the Sony stays quite high at 8 frames per second. The Olympus OMD EM1 Mark II is a very interesting rival because it's got a stack of very, very, very high speed modes. And when I was shooting with it, it did appear to be giving pretty much live feedback at a ridiculous rate. But I need to fully test all of that before I can comment on it. But certainly the M1 Mark II is very special in that regard. But if we just kind of put that aside, and it is a more expensive camera, it's a $2,000 body, let's look at that when I've fully tested it. But right now, the A6500 is really good at that. And one of the things that they've also improved, not that anyone complained, is that most of Sony's new cameras going forward have got a new component, which they call a front side LSI. People go, what's an LSI? That's a large scale integrated circuit. And the front side bit means that it's in part of the imaging pipeline where it can access loads of data really quickly. And because it's a very fast processor, it can burn its way through it, chew its way through that data very quickly, processing it quickly. So what that means the A6500 can do, it does not accelerate the autofocus. It's the same speed. It does not accelerate the burst shooting. It is the same speed. What it does, however, do is accelerate the processing of those images, in turn flushing out that buffer quickly. And I think they may have also increased the buffer size as well. Not sure, but the bottom line is you can just keep shooting for a ridiculously long period of time with this camera. Now, I never take anything for granted, so I, of course, tested this. I'm just looking at my figures now.
I've got them right here for you.
Yeah, so I mean, I took in JPEG at 11 frames per second. I got 319 frames. 319 frames before it began to pause. That's just under 30 seconds. Mm-hmm. Just under 30 seconds of shooting at 11 frames per second. In RAW, I got I got 110. 110 RAW frames at 11 frames per second. If you take it down to 8 frames per second, you get even more. So you can shoot RAWs for about 10 or 15 seconds. You can shoot JPEGs for about 30 seconds. There is no other camera that can do this. You know, you could go, well, I don't know about, I've not tested D4 or 1DX Mark II, but certainly a D500 or a 7D Mark II, which are in the same price bracket, they are quick, you know, and they have good burst depth, but nothing like this. And this is also way, way, way deeper than the A6300. And what this means is that, you know, you can be shooting action, say in JPEG. Most action takes place pretty quickly. You know, if you're shooting sports, it's normally only a few bursts. But imagine someone cycling towards you like this. And I have seen this situation when I position myself, say, at the Tour de France, at the top of a very long road. And it could take them maybe 10, 12 seconds to get from where you first see them to where they're going past you. You have to pause before you start shooting, because you know that if you were to start shooting straight away, your buffer would run out about halfway through, and then you'd be shooting at whatever, 3 frames per second as they went past. Now, no problem. As soon as you see them, hold your finger down on the button, which I should note is slightly wider than the A6300, and for 30 seconds. You know, is massive. So if that sort of thing is important to you, that is another benefit that the 6500 has over the 6300. And indeed, this is something you'll see on any of Sony's cameras when they talk about them having a front-side LSI. That is the thing that it lets you do, shoot massive bursts. You've got it on the RX100 Mark V, you've got it in the A99 Mark II. I think they're going to put this component, like Bluetooth, in, I would imagine, in all of their higher-end bodies going forward. So this is a good thing. I mean, Sony are great at processing, and that's a new benefit.
Well, good. So you hinted that this has a larger shutter release button. What other physical changes does the camera have compared to the 6300?
Okay, not many. All right. The first is that the shutter release button is slightly wider than before. The second is that there are now, if you've got can you hold up the 6300, Doug?
I happen to have it with the massive 85 f1.4 here.
I see. Do you own that lens? Is that yours?
I do.
Nice.
It is a thing of
show
beauty.
Me the top. Show me the top. You are a thing of beauty, Doug. Show me the top. The top surface. And you will notice there is one custom function button by the shutter release.
Right there.
There's now 2 on the A6500.
Not one custom button, but 2 custom buttons, huh?
Yay.
Wow.
Yeah, and the grip is slightly deeper. And that does make it easier, more comfortable to hold lenses like that. So the grip is now deeper. The shutter release is now wider. There are 2 custom function buttons, and there is a touch screen. Those are the physical differences. So not a great deal, but at least they've done something, eh? They could have just left it. But now let's move on to some of the things that you would expect a $1,400 camera to have, but it doesn't.
Yeah, because we've hinted at some of them, but no camera is perfect. We've talked about some of the flaws. What else do you wish this camera had, especially when you consider that this really is such a prime camera for shooting action? Right.
So amazing autofocus system, amazing burst shooting, amazing buffer depth, right? You would imagine this sort of camera is ideal for sports and wildlife. And as such, it should have a maximum shutter speed of, say, 0.008 of a second. After all, that's what every other single camera at this price point offers. Nope. This has the same shutter mechanism as the previous models, which means it is limited to 0.004 of a second, which is below par for a $1,400 camera. What makes it more surprising, now there is a silent electronic shutter option on it, and the interesting thing is that when you look at that on Fujifilm and Panasonic and Olympus, they all offer their electronic shutter at really high speeds, 8,000, 16,000, 32,000th of a second in some cases. Well, strangely, the electronic shutter on all of these 6,000 series is also limited to 4,000th of a second, which is frustrating because I was shooting a lot with that 85mm f1.4 in broad daylight, and if it's sunny and you're at f1.4 and you're at 100 ISO, so you're at the lowest ISO, you will bump up immediately against that top shutter speed, and your pictures will be overexposed, even at 4,000th of a second. I know because I was doing it all the time with the A6500. You could put a screw and ND filter on the front. I don't want a screw and ND filter on the front. I want a faster shutter speed. ND filter. I don't want to do that. This could be solved, even just with one stop would solve it, because it really needs to be insanely bright for you to need more than 8,000th. But 4,000th you will bump up against that in bright conditions if you're shooting at the maximum aperture. And if you shoot in sports or something like that, or you want to make, do some shallow depth of field shots, I mean, it's surely something, maybe it's a limitation with the sensor readout that they can't do it with the electronic shutter. I remember on the Fujifilm X-T1, when it came out, it was also criticized by myself and others that it had a maximum mechanical shutter of 4,000th of a second. They've now addressed that on the X-T2 and the X Pro 2. But the way they addressed it on that is they updated the firmware and they offered an electronic shutter that went up to 32,000. So if you think about that, that's 1 stop to 8, 2 stops to 16, 3 stops to 32. So that gives you 3 stops of exposure latitude. Yes, there's problems with skewing artifacts, blah, blah, blah. But at least if the subject is static or coming towards you and you're not panning quickly, at least you can take the picture. But you can't. So that's a strange limitation for a camera at this price point. I should also say that, show me your camera again, Doug.
Okay, there we go.
Now, where is the battery on this camera?
There's the battery on the bottom.
As you would expect. Now, where's the memory card slot?
That's interesting. It's in the same place.
It's in the memory. It's in the
I have no battery.
compartment.
Oh my gosh.
So this is, what kind of camera does that remind you of? That's like a kind of point and shoot type camera. Now, if you're looking at a really high-end camera, a $1,400 camera, they don't normally have the memory card in there. Where would they normally have the memory card?
In a separate slot, in a separate compartment on the side of the camera.
On the grip side, that's where it normally is. One of the main reasons being that when you have this camera mounted on a tripod, which you may do being a serious photographer because it's a $1,400 camera, when this camera is mounted on a tripod, you cannot open the battery compartment, which means you cannot access that memory card, which is very annoying. That catches me out more than you would think. That's frustrating. But what's quietly happened over the past couple of generations is that dual memory card slots have become not a luxury, but a thing, an actual standard at this price point. The X-T2 has them, the OMD M1 Mark II has them, the D500 has them, the 7D Mark II has them, and Sony's looking a little bit out of place here. Not only does it only have one memory card slot, but it is in the bottom of the camera like a point and shoot. That is fine for a sub $1,000 camera in 2016, but for a $1,400 camera, it bothers me a little bit. We mentioned earlier that there's no headphone jack. Most of the cameras don't. Some of them do. But it would be nice if it had it, or at least had it as some accessory that you could attach. Something else I noticed that all of the competition has, but it doesn't, is raw processing and playback. Now, I use this all the time. I don't do raw processing on my computer very often, but I do it frequently in cameras. So because I use it to apply different picture styles or to tweak the curves or something. That can normally I get the JPEGs I want straight out of camera, but sometimes I need to tweak them a little bit, just a tiny bit, and I can normally do that in camera. If I have the raw file, there's normally a menu in playback that says, do you want to process the raw file? And it gives you options normally to adjust the exposure, adjust the color, sharpness, contrast, the output, compression, that sort of thing. Well, unless it's hidden very, very deeply, unless we forget, it could, because Sony's menus are very difficult to find their way around. Maybe it is in there. I couldn't find it. If it is in there, let me know. But I could not find it. And if it's not in there again, that's another thing you think it should have, and it doesn't. So there's a few of these things that you kind of, you're aware of them being issues on the older models, but you weren't that bothered, especially on things like the A6000, because that's like a $500-600 camera, and the A6300 a bit more annoying, but kind of forgivable. But once you get over $1,000, my expectations are, I don't know about you, Doug, there is a price point where one's expectations become higher, I think not unreasonably, and there's a few things that this camera doesn't do that I think it should. For that money.
There are always frustrations that I think what's particularly concerning, and we've mentioned it a lot during this review, is that Sony have had time to solve these problems because they're problems that have existed for years and they haven't really done it. There's the whole menu system. We can go on and on. We won't do that. They, as you said, I'm summarizing here, but the touch screen, they finally do touch screen, but it's sort of half-assed. They didn't really follow through with it. They still don't have the ability to flip the screen all the way or fully articulate the screen. Okay, I'll give them that one. But it's interesting that they tend to focus on the most technically complex issues and yet Sony tends to lag in some of the usability aspects. I mean, there are few cameras technically that can beat Sony for what they're doing out there, but boy, some of the niggly things just drive you nuts.
And the other thing that I think it's worth mentioning is that so far we focus just on the body and the body features. But when you're choosing a camera, you've got to look at the whole system, look at the lenses, look at the accessories. And the problem I have with Sony's E-mount is that there have not been a great deal of new lenses released for it recently. Sony's really concentrated on its FE lenses. Those are the ones designed for full frame, all of which, I should add, or all of which that I've tested, have been extremely high quality. And of course, they work just fine on the APS-C bodies, and they give you an upgrade path. Or, if you've got a full frame body and a crop body, then effectively you carry one lens, you've got two different focal lengths. That's brilliant. But if you only have an APS-C body or you want to go out and travel light, well, you know what? I don't want to carry FE lenses with me. I don't want to carry an unnecessarily large, heavy, and expensive lens just because it's corrected for a frame size that I'm not going to use. I want some high-quality APS-C lenses. And the problem I have is that every time I test one of these cameras, I try out some existing E-mount APS-C lenses, and invariably they disappoint in some way, especially in corner sharpness. It's like Sony's really raised its game with its FE lenses, and they're great quality. Even on full frame sensors, they're really, really good. But it's older lenses, the E-mount lenses, a lot of them are not as good as they should be, especially for the money. And this got me thinking, what I really want to see, because this is now a high-end body, I want to see a weatherproofed general purpose zoom, maybe an f2.8 zoom, or I don't care, maybe a very high quality f4 zoom, something that the 16 to 70 millimeter Zeiss should be but isn't. It's an expensive lens, it's got a great focal range, but in the corners, especially at wide angle, it's not very sharp, and it should be for that money. Also, I was talking about photographing the cycling. Yes, Sony's got two great mirrorless 70 to 200 lenses, an f4, which I own, and an f2.8 G Master, which I used a lot on the A6500. I got loads of samples with that in my review at cameralabs.com. And it performs brilliantly, as you'd expect. But again, it's a very big and heavy and expensive lens. And I don't need that full frame coverage on this body. And it keeps bringing me back to the companies that only have one sensor size, like, say, Fujifilm. So they've got a 50 to 140 f2.8, which is much cheaper and lighter because it's only corrected for APS-C, but at least it's still giving me the same-ish range and the f2.8 focal ratio. And again, on the Fujifilm system, a lot of its lenses are actually quite affordable and very high quality. And I want to see more of that from Sony. I want to see more E-mount lenses that are that this camera is begging for. As they gradually raise the price of these bodies, it makes you look at the lenses more critically, I think. Now, if you are going to be fitting FE lenses, the full frame ones, maybe you've got a full frame body or you're thinking of getting one, don't worry about what I've just said. Just buy the FE lenses and be at peace with it because they are very good. But if you're not, or if you want a separate lighter system, which again, I don't want to use my expression lest we forget, but again, the reason you've got this nice small light body is because you want nice small light lenses, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Then can we have some? People will say, oh, you can mount, Sigma's got that really nice f1.8 zoom. You can put that on, but that's designed for DSLRs, not mirrorless cameras. So you need an adapter for it, and it works well, but it becomes quite a big thing. So again, you're missing out on that kind of compact nature.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, they can't do everything. A few years ago, we complained Sony didn't have any E-mount lenses at all. And they've done very well at really building up that inventory over time and playing catch up to the other mirrorless manufacturers. As you said, these G lenses that are full frame are marvelous. But so why do I like the 6300, 6500 series? To me, they are my action cameras, things that I used to use my high-end Nikon DSLRs for, which I no longer own. If I want to go shoot action, that's the camera I grab. So what do I shoot with it? Well, again, with this 85 f1.4, as you say, it makes it about a 135, a fast 135. It's larger than it would need to be because of the sensor size, but that's okay. Same thing with a 70 to 200. I love having that 300 millimeter equivalent look that I can take out. And I use the f4. I don't have the fast f2.8 version. So pairing this with a 70 to 200 f4 lens, is a very nice tool for shooting, again, birds or airplanes or whales, which I think is great. But I still also have, you mentioned it very briefly, I have one of the very early lenses for this camera. Actually, it goes back to the NEX days, which is this Zeiss 24 f1.8, which is still quite a good lens.
Yeah, I tested it. I used it quite a lot on the 6500 because I remember when the Nex 7 came out, that lens came out about the same time, and a friend of mine bought them at the same time and let me try them both out. I thought, wow, this is really nice. Now, I also had a quite nice close focusing distance on it. So I tried it again on the 6500 and again, soft in the corners at even close to f5.6, which is, kind of an optimal aperture on APS-C. It should be sharper in the corners, and the equivalents on Fujifilm and Olympus and Panasonic are sharp in the corners, at wider aperture. So I was a bit disappointed by that, and you can see that again. I've got samples with it. So again, it's like every time I test them, I take the opportunity to try some other ones, and maybe there are some gems in the catalog that I've not tried yet, but it does frustrate me.
Well, it's as you're pointing out. What this really does is question Sony's commitment to the APS-C sensor line. Part of the problem is they've had so much success with the full frame. Much more, I think, than they expected, perhaps. So interesting to follow. Hey, I want to try something that we didn't discuss. I'm going to put you on the spot here. We're going to try a lightning round. I'm going to mention 5 cameras in order of increasing price. And I want you to tell me in 1 or 2 sentences how you would put it up against the 6500, okay?
All right, I'll try.
And if it doesn't work, it won't be in the show. Let's give this a try. So, I'm going to mention a camera. You give me your initial reaction relative to the Sony Alpha 6500. Here we go. The Olympus OMD EM5 Mark II. $500 cheaper. Go.
Okay, fully articulated screen and better image stabilization. So if you're going to be doing a lot of filming handheld, I would prefer that camera, but it doesn't have 4K. The autofocus isn't as good, but the lens selection is better. It's a contender, and it's a better looking camera with nicer controls.
Okay. At $400 less expensive than the 6500 comes the Lumix G80 or G85, depending upon where you live.
Right, I haven't fully tested that camera yet. I've played with it, so I will have to be brief. It does look like a really nice featured camera. It does 4K video. Again, fully articulated screen, built-in stabilization, great lens selection. Again, the focusing is not going to be as good on it. It's not phase detect, but the DFD Panasonic technology does work well. It's going to be really nice for the money. Definitely for the money, it's really nice. And a centrally located viewfinder hub.
Okay, so that was a trick question. You did very well on that one. Here's a softball for you. The Sony Alpha 6300, also $400 less than this. We've talked about it a lot.
That's easy. It's basically the 6500 without the stabilization, without the touchscreen, and without the Bluetooth, and a couple of other things. If you can live without those 3 things, then you are, and the deeper buffer. If you can live without those 4 things, then you have got a camera that still shoots at 11 frames per second with amazing autofocus, and is weatherproof and does the job. It is a brilliant action camera. But as you mentioned earlier, you were saying, oh, the great thing about the 6300, I take it out as my action camera. I do too, but the 6500 with the stabilization suddenly makes it a much more desirable all-round camera. That's the key difference I really noticed when I was shooting with it. It's more all-round, whereas the previous one I would kind of generally mostly use for kind of sports and action.
This is going to be an expensive show. You're going to force me to sell my 6300 and upgrade to the 65. I'm tired of doing that. Okay, 2 cameras to wrap this up. These are slightly more expensive. The first, at $200 more than the 6500, is the Fuji X-T2, $1,600 in the US.
This is a really interesting one, and I should say that I've gone into a massive amount of detail in my review at cameralabs.com. So if you go to the verdict page, I've compared all of their features, so that's what you should look at. The X-T2 is outfeatured by the A6500, right? The A6500 is technically the better camera, but it becomes a very emotional thing for me. And I can only speak personally at this point. Personally speaking, I much prefer the controls and the handling of the Fujifilm. And I also personally prefer its output of its JPEGs with the default settings. This is important for me because I do not like processing RAW files. I like to get JPEGs that are perfect out the camera, and the Fujifilm gives me that. Most of the systems I have to work them a bit. Fuji gives me them straight out of camera. So that convenience, coupled with a camera that I think is better looking with nicer controls and with a greater selection of APS-C lenses that are cheaper and better quality, makes me side towards the Fujifilm. But it's more expensive. It does not have stabilization. It does not have a touch screen. There's a lot of things. It doesn't even have, it only has 3-frame auto exposure bracketing. It's amazing how emotional you can get with these things and how forgiving you can be on a camera that you personally find attractive. Technically speaking, the Sony is superior and it's cheaper. So it's a tricky one to weigh up.
We should also mention that, just as you're saying that, it made me realize Olympus, certainly, Fuji, are dedicated pretty much to a single size sensor for the most part. Panasonic has a range, but Sony has many different size sensors that they deploy in their cameras. So the company's resources are spread a bit wider, let's say, than Olympus, which I think is really focusing on that. The last one then, at the top of the price list, the big brother to the Olympus OMD EM5 Mark II is the Olympus OMD EM1 Mark II, coming in $600 more expensive than this Alpha 6500.
$600 more and a smaller Micro Four Thirds sensor. And that is enough for most people, or for some people, to go, are you crazy? Why on earth would I go for the Olympus? But remember, the smaller sensor, don't spin it as a disadvantage, spin it as an advantage. Again, it means that it can have access to this amazing catalog of small and high quality lenses. It means that it can deploy unbelievably good image stabilization that is superior, especially if you're filming video and moving at the same time, like walking or running while you're filming. The autofocus on it is incredible, and the burst shooting is also incredible. I have shot with it, and you'll see some preview images that I've shot of birds and dogs and bulls and horses and all manner of wildlife at cameralabs.com. I have not fully tested this camera at the time we filmed this video, so I cannot give you a definitive comparison. Certainly Olympus is pushing that. I mean, that price, $2,000. Even if it was APS-C, it's a lot of money. It's up against, Nikon D500s. It's up against more than that. It's a tough price point, but it's a lot of camera and it's beautiful to use. And the output looks great. Sometimes you have to just forget about the size of the sensor and look at the pictures. Are they delivering the quality you want in the environment in which you're shooting? And you've got to forget about a lot of things that you're used to. Previously when I shot with this, it couldn't do it. Forget about what happened previously. Try it again now and see if it's still doing it. So it's a very, very impressive camera so far, but I've not tested it that much. But it's still tough. It's still tough. $2,000. I mean, it makes you think, it makes you come back, the price of that and the Fujifilm. And okay, another difference with the Fujifilm and the Sony, which I've mentioned earlier in the review, was that the Fuji, unless you buy the grip, which also brings it to about $2,000, it's only doing 10-minute 4K clips. It's only shooting at 8 frames per second. The Sony's doing half-hour 4K clips and 11 frames per second, just with the body at $1,400. And it's uncropped 4K. As long as it's at 2425p, it's uncropped. None of the others are doing that. Well, the Olympus will do it, but of course the sensor's smaller. The Sony is doing a lot. It's doing a lot. If they only manage to improve those menus and the consistency and stuff, then it would be such an amazing system. As it is, there is so much that's good about the A6500 that in my review at Camera Labs, I still gave it our top award, the highly recommended award. There are some limitations it doesn't have. There are some issues that I have with it, but it's just so much better. The new features make it so much better than the previous version, and it just offers so much for the money that I think it's a highly compelling camera. It's a very, very good camera.
Very good. Well, I think we've covered this one very, very thoroughly. Excellent review, Gordon. Thank you. And I want to encourage anybody who hasn't had enough about the A6500, if you're considering purchasing and want to know everything, even more about it, go over to cameralabs.com, read Gordon's written review. They're extremely thorough. And if you do want to purchase a Sony Alpha 6500 or any of the other cameras or lenses we mentioned here on the Camera Labs Photography Podcast, please go to cameralabs.com and click on the purchase links there. It will help us put food on the table and coffee in the cups.
You could also buy, if you like what Doug and I do, you can buy us a coffee. There's links to do that at Camera Labs. If you're listening to this on iTunes, on the podcast, please do rate us, unless you hate it, in which case don't. But, leave a review or a star rating, then more people can find it and we can film and record more of these. So it's great if you can do that. We hope that you're enjoying this dual format that we do. The videos are on YouTube, the audio's on iTunes, and also on Libsyn as well. I've got links to that review. And I should also say that, Doug, no, let me plug you, Doug.
Okay.
Doug Kay is a wonderful human being. I love him dearly, and he does amazing photo walks around the world, specializing particularly in places like Cuba. If you would like to spend some time with this guy taking pictures, and why wouldn't you, go to dougkay.com to find out when his next walks and tutorials and workshops are, because they're well worth checking out. Thank
you, Gordon. And of course, always feel free to leave us comments. We love hearing from you. If you detect any errors, please correct us. If you have any questions, point them out as well. And we look forward to seeing you again on another episode of the Camera Labs Photography Podcast. Bye-bye, Gordon. Thanks.
See you, Doug. Thanks for watching and listening.
Bye-bye.